On a winter morning in New York, under the harsh white lights of the United Nations, a thin man in a crumpled suit is calmly destroying the patience of the most powerful countries on Earth. The clock on the wall says he should have stopped speaking hours ago. Delegates are slumped in their chairs. Translators in glass booths rub their eyes. A few diplomats glance at the exits, calculating, if he doesn't stop soon, the entire day's schedule collapses. But VK, Krishna Menon, does not stop. Cigarette smoke curls above his head as he leans into the microphone. His voice, dry and sharp like a blade on stone, circles around one word, Kashmir. Across from him sit the representatives of Pakistan, led by a man just as educated, just as articulate, just as determined to win. This is not a polite debate. It is a duel. One of them will walk out having defined the narrative of the conflict for the world. The other will be a footnote. The chairman taps his pencil. The time limit has passed. Menon glances at the clock, then keeps talking as if he has personally declared war on the very idea of a schedule. 8 hours. One of the longest speeches in UN history. By the time he finally collapses, fainting in the corridor from exhaustion and high blood pressure, the newspapers will call him a fanatic, a hero, a madman, a genius. To his admirers, this is courage. To his enemies, this is arrogance. But to understand why a man would push his body to the point of collapse just to keep a microphone for a few more minutes, we have to go back 50 years to a coastal town in the blazing heat of southern India, to a boy who already felt that time was his enemy. The British Empire had all the time in the world. Krishna Menon did not. He was born in 1896 in Calicut, on the Malabar coast, where the Arabian Sea beat endlessly against the shore like a drum. The air smelled of salt and spices and wood smoke. Ships from distant lands had been docking there for centuries, unloading pepper, cardamom, and ideas. On some evenings, when the sky was long and red, you could watch fishermen hauling heavy nets in absolute silence while only a few streets inland, English voices rang out from whitewashed colonial buildings. Inside one of those low-tiled Nair houses, a skinny boy sat cross-legged on the floor, his nose buried in a book much too thick for his age. This was Krishna. The oil lamp flickered, staining the walls with restless, moving shadows. Outside, the sound of boots and horse hooves echoed faintly, a reminder that this was British territory, however Indian it looked and felt and tasted. His family was respectable but not wealthy. His father, Krishna Kurup, worked as a lawyer's clerk. His mother, Janaki Amma, was strict, intelligent, and fiercely proud of their Malayalam heritage. From her, Krishna learned the stories of old Kerala kingdoms that had stood long before the British flag ever flew. From his father, he learned something else, the texture of humiliation. Every time a British officer entered the office, the room shifted. Indian clerks straightened up, smiles tightened on their faces. Words like, "Yes, sir," came out too quickly, too politely. The boy watched this theater with cold, burning curiosity. Why did his father, educated, capable, suddenly become smaller in the shadow of a man who could barely pronounce Malabar? In school, that imbalance followed him everywhere. The missionary teachers spoke of civilization as if it wore only one color, the red of the empire. Maps on the walls painted India in soft pink, the same shade as Canada and Australia, distant lands he could barely imagine. When Krishna asked one of his teachers why India was ruled from London, the man smiled thinly and said, "Because it is better for you this way. You must be patient. In time, perhaps, you will understand." Patience. That word made something twist inside him. He was not built to wait. He was built to argue. He argued with classmates, with teachers, with anyone who would stand still long enough. He argued about caste, about religion, about why English literature was considered superior to the stories his grandmother told him at night. He learned to use English not as a chain, but as a weapon. Every essay, every debate, every carefully sharpened insult was another brick in the fortress he was building in his mind. One day a teacher pulled him aside after class. "Krishna," he said, "you are clever, but clever boys must learn to bend a little. The British like obedient Indians, not difficult ones. If you work hard and behave, you might become an officer in their administration one day. Imagine an Indian in real power." Real power. The phrase lodged like a thorn. Even at 15, Krishna Menon understood the trick. Power granted by the ruler under the ruler's terms was not power. It was decoration. But another kind of possibility soon entered his life, wrapped in ideas that would change him more deeply than any exam or lecture. It came from Madras, and it had a name, the Theosophical Society. By the time he reached college in Madras, the city was a furnace of movement. Streetcars rattled past crowded markets. Pamphlets appeared overnight under doorways, printed in cheap ink that left dark smears on fingers. The word nationalism moved from whisper to murmur. Men in khadi walked past in quiet defiance of imported British cloth. In this restless city, Krishna discovered a world of books and languages bigger than anything he had seen in Calicut. He studied at Presidency College, then at the National College, founded by Indian nationalists after the 1905 partition of Bengal. It was there that he first heard in person the ringing voice of a woman who seemed to burn with pure conviction, Annie Besant. Besant was unlike any English person he had ever seen. She did not defend the empire, she attacked it. She spoke of home rule for India, of spiritual equality and political freedom in the same breath, as if they were inseparable. She poured contempt on the smug assurance of British officials who believed Indians would never govern themselves. When Krishna Menon listened to her, something clicked. Until then, his anger at British superiority had been intense but unfocused, like heat trapped under a lid. Besant lifted the lid. He joined the Theosophical Society, drawn to its fusion of Eastern and Western thought, its rejection of narrow dogma, its belief that the soul did not come stamped with a national flag. He started helping with meetings, arranging chairs, writing notes, absorbing every word she said. Before long, he was no longer in the back row taking notes. He was at the table, arguing policy. That was where the first real rival of his life appeared. Not a single person with a single name, but a type, the cautious Indian. They came from good families, wore perfect suits, and spoke English with practiced ease. They believed in reform within the system, in polite petitions, in delays. Independence, if it ever came, would come gradually, legally, safely. To them, Krishna's sharp tongue and uncompromising logic were a liability. You push too hard, one of them told him over tea. You make them uncomfortable. That's not how things get done. He stared back, eyes already carrying the steely calm that would later terrify diplomats in New York. Uncomfortable, he replied, is how empires end. This collision between impatience and caution would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping every alliance and every enmity. Even among fellow Indians, he would always be too much, too radical, too intense, too relentless. And yet, again and again, when the moment came to send someone to argue India's case, they would turn to the very man they called impossible. The clock was already ticking. After the First World War, the British were weaker, but not weak enough to let go. The Russian Revolution had terrified elites across Europe. Nationalist movements were flaring up from Egypt to Ireland. The empire could not hold its grip forever, but it would not loosen it willingly. Menon sensed with something like physical urgency that there was a narrow window opening in history, and it would not stay open long. If Indians failed to seize it, if they allowed themselves to be lulled with promises of reform, the price would be another generation in chains. He was in his early 20s when he took on his first real political responsibilities under Annie Besant's wing. He helped edit her newspaper, New India, and later The Commonweal, wrestling words into weapons late into the night. Newsprint stuck to his inky fingers as he wrote editorials that ridiculed British hypocrisy, compared their talk of civilization to the realities of famine and police batons. Some nights he went home buzzing with adrenaline. On others, exhausted, he lay awake, wondering if anyone powerful was actually reading. On the streets of Madras, he saw the answer in fragments. Young men passing a broadsheet from hand to hand, eyes narrowing as they read his lines. A British policeman stuffing a crumpled newspaper into his pocket with a scowl. A merchant in the bazaar whispering, "Did you see what Besant's people wrote yesterday?" But the cautious Indians were watching too. At party meetings, he clashed with them over strategy. They wanted resolutions. He wanted confrontation. They wanted carefully worded memoranda. He wanted speeches that would sting, that would leave marks. The more he pushed, the more they whispered. "He's brilliant," someone would say, "but he's dangerous." "Reckless," another would add. Too much Besant, not enough Congress. In those cramped rooms, another figure began to loom on his personal horizon, not in person yet, but in reputation. A different kind of Indian leader, serious, patient, lawyerly. Across the subcontinent, the name Jawaharlal Nehru was starting to carry weight. Nehru, who had studied in England, who moved with ease among both Indian peasants and British intellectuals. Nehru, who spoke of socialism and freedom, but with a calm, almost aristocratic composure that contrasted sharply with Menon's volcanic intensity. If there was a future in which Krishna Menon would stand at the center of India's foreign policy, there was also a future in which he would forever be in the shadow of more polished, more acceptable men like Nehru. The rivalry wasn't personal yet, they had barely crossed paths, but it was structural, a quiet contest over what kind of Indian would speak for India when the time finally came. And always in the background, the British clock ticked on. Every new law restricting dissent, every Lothi charge at a protest, every sedition trial was a reminder that the empire still had the upper hand. Working from Madras, shouting from the sidelines would never be enough. If he wanted to change the script, he would have to go where it was being written, London. The idea first came as a suggestion from Besant, then hardened into a necessity in his own mind. Study there, she urged him. Learn their system, their arguments, their weaknesses. Sit their exams, read their philosophers, listen to their parliament. Beat them on their own ground. She saw in him something rare, not just eloquence, but an almost surgical ruthlessness with words. For Menon, the city appeared in his imagination like a dare. London, the heart of the empire that had humiliated his father and lectured his teachers. London, the place where cautious Indians went to become barristers and administrators loyal to the crown. London, where the script for India's fate was drafted in quiet rooms scented with pipe smoke. If he was going to fight for India's voice in the world, he could not remain a provincial agitator. He had to go to the center of the storm. But to get there, he needed money, papers, support. His family couldn't pay. He was not a prince or a zamandar's son. What he had were his words, his reputation in Besant's circles, and an iron refusal to be told, not yet. The race against time sharpened. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms had offered limited self-government, a tease that divided opinion among Indian leaders. Was this a step forward or a trap? Gandhi was rising, calling for non-cooperation. The world was shifting under his feet. Menon knew, if he waited too long to leave, the story might move on without him. There is something almost cinematic about the image. A young man in worn clothes standing on the deck of a ship, the humid air of Madras thick around him, staring out at the dark line where sea meets sky. Somewhere beyond that line lay a city that would test everything in him, his mind, his health, his pride, and grind him down before he could claim any sort of victory. Behind him, India remained under foreign rule. Ahead of him in London were other Indians who would become allies and enemies, critics and competitors, men who thought they knew the proper way to behave in front of white power, who would soon find themselves confronted with this sharp-tongued, uncompromising Malabar radical who seemed allergic to deference. The ship's horn bellowed. Ropes were pulled in. The dock began to slide away. For the British, this was just another colonial subject crossing the sea to seek an education, perhaps a place in their administrative machine. For the cautious Indians, it was one more ambitious young man leaving home, maybe to return as a gentleman lawyer, grateful for his training. For VK, Krishna Menon, it was a countdown. He gave himself a brutal kind of deadline in the privacy of his own thoughts. Within a single generation, his generation, India must be free, and he would not spend that generation waiting politely. Whether on the streets of London, in crowded student hostels, or one day in the echoing halls of international diplomacy, he would fight for every inch of narrative, every word, and every resolution. He did not know yet that decades later he would stand in New York, defying the chairman's gavel, pushing his exhausted body past all reasonable limits to keep talking about Kashmir while his rivals watched him with a mix of hatred and awe. He did not yet know the price he would pay, in health and reputation, for carrying that relentless urgency into every room he entered. All he knew, as the coastline of India slowly dissolved into haze behind him, was that he was done waiting for history to happen to him. From this point on, he would chase it, argue with it, wrestle with it, and whenever possible, bend it out of shape. London was supposed to be the polished, invincible face of the empire. Marble facades, stone lions, the heavy boom of Big Ben measuring out a confidence that seemed eternal. To millions in the colonies, this city was a distant, almost mythical throne. For VK, Krishna Menon stepping off the ship into the damp chill of the docks, it looked less like a throne and more like a fortress he had. Exactly one lifetime to break into and burn from the inside. The first shock was the cold. Not just the November wind knifing through his thin coat, but the cold in people's eyes when they looked at him. On the streets around the docks, men in flat caps shouldered past him without a glance. A policeman watched him a moment too long. A landlady, seeing his brown face and cheap suitcase, suddenly remembered that her rooms were all taken. In Madras, he had been the fierce young intellectual at Besant's side, the sharp tongue behind angry editorials. Here, on the wet pavements of London, he was just another colonial student with no money, no connections, and a clock already whispering in his ear, "Hurry." He rented a single shabby room. The wallpaper peeled, the bed sagged. The heating, when it existed at all, hissed weakly like it was afraid of the British winter. Some nights, when even that tiny room was beyond his means, he slept on a bench in a railway station, his coat wrapped tight, books clutched to his chest. But if you followed him in daylight, you would have seen a different kind of warmth. In the reading rooms of the London School of Economics, where he devoured political theory under the stern gaze of Harold Lasky, in lecture halls at University College London, where he studied law not to join the imperial machine, but to learn how to dismantle it piece by piece, and above all in the smoky back rooms where arguments never ended. He found his way to gatherings of British socialists, pacifists, trade unionists, people who hated the empire from within its own capital. They were not many and they were not in power, but they were loud. They passed around leaflets, organized rallies, and whispered phrases that stirred something deep in him: self-determination, workers, rights, anti-imperialism. Here in the city that ruled India, he discovered something vital. The empire was not a monolith. It had cracks. He could hear them when a factory worker in the East End shouted that Indian cotton was soaked in blood, when an old suffragette compared the struggle of Indian nationalists to her own fight for the vote. In these rooms, Menon did what he had always done. He argued. Only now his English was sharper, his references wider. He quoted Marx and Mill, Burke and Buddha. He stayed up until dawn in cafes that never seemed to close, circling the same questions again and again. How do you persuade an empire to sign its own death warrant? How do you make the British working man care about an Indian peasant he will never meet? But even as he found allies, he found a new, very specific rival. The cautious Indian had followed him to London. They sat at the front of student society meetings, dressed in immaculate suits, ties perfectly knotted. Their accents were polished at English public schools. They organized charming cultural evenings, polite debates, and well-mannered receptions for visiting British officials. They believed that if Indians in London appeared dignified, grateful, and moderate, the British would gradually loosen their grip. One evening, at a gathering of an Indian Students' Association, the clash erupted into the open. A visiting colonial undersecretary had been invited. The room was decorated with small Union Jacks and carefully arranged flowers. One of the cautious Indians, the son of a wealthy Bombay industrialist, stood up to speak. He thanked the British for the opportunities they had given colonial students. He praised their sense of justice. He hinted gently that perhaps in time India might be offered greater self-rule. When he sat down, the audience applauded. Then another hand went up. Krishna Menon rose, slow and deliberate, his hair uncombed, his clothes a little too worn for such a polished setting. His eyes were bright with a kind of controlled fury. "With respect," he began softly, "what you have just heard is not gratitude. It is the language of a prisoner praising the taste of the food in his cell." The room went dead quiet. He did not raise his voice. That made it worse. He spoke of famine, of peasants flogged for failing to pay taxes, of the obscene fact that an Indian could be hanged by a British judge in Calcutta under laws written in London by men who had never seen a rice field. He dissected the word opportunity until it lay in pieces on the floor, exposed as a bribe. The visiting official left with a tight smile. The cautious Indians were furious. "You'll ruin everything," one of them hissed afterward. "They will never take us seriously if you insult them." Menon looked at him for a long second. "They will never leave," he replied, "if we keep flattering them." From that night onwards, the rivalry hardened. There would be two Indian voices in London, one urging patience, one demanding rupture. British politicians, journalists, and civil servants would constantly be choosing which man, which tone, which future they preferred. The duel had begun. To fight it properly, Menon needed more than rhetoric. He needed an organization. In 1920s London, there were already groups agitating for Indian reform, but they were small, sleepy, cautious. So he set about changing that. He took over a moribund little pressure group and with relentless energy turned it into something else, the India League. It was a simple name, but the ambition behind it was anything but simple. The League would not ask for adjustments. It would demand complete independence. It would not limit itself to genteel petitions. It would put India on the front pages of British newspapers, on the lips of dock workers and housewives. He rented tiny, grimy offices where the smell of boiled cabbage from the upstairs flat mixed with the metallic tang of printer's ink. He dictated pamphlets at 2 a.m., his voice hoarse while a tired typist hammered at the keys. He cajoled friends into folding leaflets until their fingers hurt. Night after night, he walked the dark streets of working-class districts, sticking posters to lampposts and walls, announcing public meetings in town halls and church basements. At those meetings, the rivalry with the cautious Indians played out like theater. On one side of the stage, the respectable barrister from India, speaking calmly about constitutional reforms, about gradual progress. On the other side, Krishna Menon, thin, intense, eyes blazing under the harsh electric light. The moderate would talk of our shared civilization with Britain. Menon would follow, holding up grainy photos of starving villagers, of police beating protesters in India. He would say, "This is your civilization at work." There was something almost dangerous in the way he refused to soften his language. British MPs walked out in disgust. Newspapers called him extremist, ungrateful, insolent. But in the slums and factory districts where men remembered their own hunger and humiliation, there were murmurs of approval. One evening, after a particularly fierce speech in a North London hall, a burly dock worker approached him, wiping sweat and coal dust from his face. "Never thought much about India," the man said. "But if what you say is right, it's a bloody shame. What do you want us to do?" That sentence, "What do you want us to do?" was the opening he had been waiting for. He told them, "Pressure your MPs. Join the League. Refuse to cheer the empire automatically. Look at the map and ask who benefits when half the world is colored red." While all this was happening, he was living a double life, perhaps a triple one. By day, he attended lectures, passed exams, sat for the bar at the Middle Temple. He walked through courts in a second-hand gown, arguing small cases to pay his rent. For a time, he worked in publishing, moving among manuscripts and proofs, eventually helping to shape the early radical vision of cheap paperbacks that would become Pelican books, knowledge for the masses, not just for the elite. By evening, he was a local politician in the heart of London. In 1934, against all odds, he was elected to the Borough Council of St. Pancras as a labor representative. Picture the scene. In a stuffy council chamber under portraits of dead English mayors, an Indian from Calicut sat at the same table, as retired colonels and shopkeepers, arguing about housing, libraries, public health. It was a trivial local body in one sense, but in another it was extraordinary. A colonial subject helping to govern a piece of the imperial capital. "You are the first Indian I've ever voted for," one old woman told him after a meeting. "I suppose that makes me a bit of a revolutionary, doesn't it?" He smiled thinly. "It makes you sensible," he said. "We have enough colonels already." He pushed for milk for school children, for libraries to stay open late, for council houses to be built not as monuments but as humane homes. He was learning something vital, how to navigate committees, budgets, and rules, not to obey them but to weaponize them. Meanwhile, across Europe, the sky was darkening. Hitler marched into Czechoslovakia. Mussolini bombed Ethiopia. Franco crushed the Spanish Republic. War was no longer a question. It was a countdown. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and without consulting a single Indian voter, declared India at war as well. For Menon, this created an impossible moral knot. He hated fascism. He saw in Nazi racial theories a mirror of imperial arrogance, stripped of its polite language. Yet he also knew that the empire was using the crisis to tighten its grip on India, not loosen it. How could he urge Indians to support a war for freedom when they themselves were unfree? The cautious Indians once again advocated patience. "Let us support Britain now," they argued. After the war, they will reward us. It would be unseemly to make demands at a time like this. Menon's response was brutal. At a time like this, he said, is precisely when you make demands. When empires are frightened, they listen. His speeches shifted tone. He condemned fascism unequivocally, but he insisted that Indian soldiers' blood could not be treated as a cheap resource. If Britain wanted India's cooperation, it had to promise real independence on a fixed timetable. In Whitehall, the file on him at MI5 grew thicker. They intercepted his mail, tapped phones, sent agents to slip into the back of his meetings and take notes. Intelligent, articulate, dangerous, one report described him. Another underlined a more specific fear: has access to prominent members of the labor left. That access was his other hidden card. Over the years, he had cultivated friendships among British socialists who would later run the country, men like Stafford Cripps, who straddled the worlds of law, politics, and idealism. They argued late into the night about the post-war order, about colonialism, about socialism. To some, Menon was a fascinating curiosity. To others, an uncomfortable conscience. Then, one day in the late 1930s, a different kind of visitor walked into his London world and changed its orbit. Jawaharlal Nehru. The two men met in cramped offices and in smoky drawing rooms, at public rallies and private dinners. Nehru, already a leading figure in the Indian National Congress, had come to England to plead India's case, to meet allies, to feel the temperature of British politics as war loomed. On paper, they were oddly matched. Nehru, the patrician from Allahabad, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, moving with effortless grace. In elite circles, Menon, the perpetually disheveled Malabar radical, with a razor tongue and no patience for small talk. In practice, something clicked. They talked about socialism, about secularism, about the dangers of religious nationalism. They shared a distrust of both imperial condescension and domestic reactionaries. Nehru saw in Menon not just an outraged nationalist, but a man who understood the psychology of the British ruling class in a way few Indians did. Menon saw in Nehru the future prime minister of a free India, and perhaps the only leader who would ever be willing to tolerate his intensity. Their informal alliance terrified Menon's rivals. If Nehru trusted him, he was no longer just an irritant in London. He was a potential bridge between Delhi and the British left, between the Indian struggle and the corridors of power in Westminster. Other Congress leaders, more conservative, more cautious, began to mutter in private. Krishna Menon, one of them scoffed. That fellow? He is too extreme, too divisive. We cannot have him represent us abroad. But time and war were about to squeeze everyone. In 1942, with Japanese armies advancing toward India's eastern borders, Churchill's government sent Stafford Cripps to offer a deal. Help us win the war, and we will talk about your freedom afterward. Menon was in the thick of the conversations in London, trying to push the offer beyond vague promises into something concrete. He failed. The terms were too little, too late. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. British jails filled with Congress leaders, including Nehru. At meetings in London, some sympathizers looked at Menon with open accusation. Did you misjudge them? A British socialist asked. Did you push too hard, make them suspicious? He bit back his anger. They were never serious, he said. Not about real independence. War or no war, they still think of us as subjects. The strain showed. Years of overwork, of cheap food and cheaper cigarettes, of sleeping in chairs and missing meals began to take their toll. One night, after a furious argument at a meeting of the India League, he simply folded, collapsing in the corridor like he would many years later in the United Nations. In the harsh light of a London hospital ward, a doctor stood over him, frowning. If you continue like this, the man said, you won't live to see your India free. You must slow down. Menon stared at the ceiling, jaw tight. India doesn't have the luxury of slowing down, he muttered. The doctor sighed. Your arteries do. He left with a warning and a prescription. Menon crumpled the paper into his pocket. The time limit that had always hummed in the background of his mind now had a physical echo in his body. He knew he was burning himself at both ends. He kept burning. When the war finally ended, it brought no peace to India, only a new kind of urgency. Labour swept to power in Britain in 1945. Many of the men now sitting in cabinet offices were old acquaintances of Menon's from the days of pamphlets and platform speeches. Clement Attlee, Norman Dodds, Stafford Cripps. They were no longer backbench rebels. They were the government. On paper, this was his moment. He hurried from office to office, lobbying, arguing, reminding them of every speech they had ever made about self-determination. He thrust photographs of communal riots and famine across desks. He warned in chillingly precise language what would happen if the transfer of power was delayed: blood, partition, chaos. At the same time, another figure was carving out his own story in London's smoky corridors: Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, demanding a separate nation, Pakistan. The British, ever adept at divide and rule, listened carefully to both sides, weighing not just their arguments but their tones, their apparent reasonableness. In closed rooms, the rivalry became personal. On one side of a polished table, Jinnah, impeccably dressed, cool, precise, his arguments legalistic, his demands simple. We are a separate nation. We will not accept a Hindu-dominated India. On the other, Menon, lean, intense, arguing that India must remain one, that partition would be a tragedy engineered by those who never intended to stay and pick up the pieces. He spoke of centuries of shared history, of the danger of carving countries along religious lines. The British watched these two men, not on equal footing, for Menon was not a formal negotiator for Congress, but as proxies for deeper forces. One offered clarity, however brutal. The other, complexity, with the promise of a secular united India that even many Indians were unsure they wanted. As the talks seesawed, a deadline appeared on the calendar like a cliff. June 1948. That was the date the British announced for the transfer of power. To Menon, it sounded less like a promise and more like a threat. If Indian leaders could not agree by then, the retreating empire would draw the final lines itself. In the end, even that date dissolved. Violence escalated faster than anyone had dared predict. Trains arrived at stations soaked in blood. Villages burned. Refugees poured across imagined borders that had not yet been officially drawn. Amid this chaos, Congress and the Muslim League finally agreed to partition. India and Pakistan would be born as twins separated at birth, each bearing deep scars. And what of Menon, the man who had spent 2 decades shouting in London that India must be free? His own fate was decided in a different kind of closed-door meeting, this time in Delhi. With independence suddenly real and terrifying, Congress leaders argued over appointments like men dividing up a bomb they all suspected might explode in their faces. When the question arose, who should represent the new India in London? The room shivered with subtext. There are experienced civil servants, someone said, men who know protocol. We cannot send a wild man like Menon, another leader snapped. He has offended half of Whitehall already. Nehru listened. Then, in his quiet, decisive way, he cut through. Precisely because they know him, he said, and because he knows them, we need him there. He understands the British mind. He has spent his life fighting them on their own ground. He will not be intimidated. It was a gamble. Some would call it a mistake. But in 1947, as the British flag came down in Delhi, it became official. The boy from Calicut, whose father had once shrunk in the presence of British officers, was now India's first High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. On a grey London morning in a building near Aldwych, the Union Jack was lowered and a new flag was raised. Saffron, white, green, with a blue wheel at its heart. Krishna Menon stood in the crowd, face unreadable as the cloth snapped in the wind. He walked through corridors where, for generations, Indians had entered as supplicants. Now secretaries rose when he entered. British officials addressed him as Your Excellency. Drivers opened doors. Invitations poured in. And yet, if you watched him closely, you would see that he wore the new power like a slightly ill-fitting coat. His suits were a little less crumpled, but his voice in meetings was no softer. He fought with the British over everything. Over the sterling balances owed to India after the war, over the treatment of Indian immigrants, or over the terms of Commonwealth membership. He refused the easy script of gratitude. At a dinner in a London club when a retired general praised Indian troops for their loyalty in the war, Menon replied icily, "They did not die for your empire, General. They died because they were told they had no choice." In Delhi, reports drifted back. High Commissioner quarrels constantly. His manner offends important figures. Civil servants find him impossible. Within the new Indian Foreign Service, largely staffed by men from the old ICS, resentment simmered. They had spent careers mastering discretion. Then this self-made London radical had been handed the plum post. He was, in a very real sense, still fighting the same competitor he had faced as a student, the cautious Indian, now wearing the neat uniform of the diplomat. If only the Prime Minister would appoint a proper official, one senior bureaucrat wrote privately. Menon is a law unto himself. Nehru, for the moment, stood by him. The stakes were no longer just India and Britain. The world had split into two armed camps, the United States and the Soviet Union, capitalism and communism, each demanding loyalty, each dangling aid and threats. Newly independent nations were expected to choose a side quickly. Menon thought that was another kind of trap. In his small office in the High Commission, long after everyone else had gone home, he would sit with world maps spread across the desk, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. He traced imaginary lines connecting Delhi to Cairo, Jakarta to Accra, countries still under colonial rule, countries on the brink of independence, countries about to be pulled into someone else's war. If India could speak hard enough, fast enough in the right forums, maybe it could help create a third path, non-alignment. Not neutral, not passive, but choosing its own interests instead of marching behind someone else's flag. For that, Delhi would need more than polite, careful diplomats. It would need someone willing to stand, alone if necessary, in rooms full of hostile faces and talk until the clock surrendered. From London, the next step was obvious. The United Nations in New York. Nehru made his move. In the early 1950s, he brought Menon formally into the Indian cabinet as a minister without portfolio and sent him as India's chief delegate to the UN. The cautious Indians in Delhi were horrified. They had seen for years what he was capable of in small British committee rooms. Now he would have a global microphone. They whispered, they plotted, they waited for him to fail. Menon, unfazed, packed his papers, his books, his threadbare suits, and prepared to move his battlefield from the fog of London to the blinding lights of international diplomacy. The boy who had once been told to be patient was now walking toward the single biggest stage on which a former colony could speak back to the world. He had less than a decade, he sensed, before age, illness, and internal enemies would catch up with him. Less than a decade to carve India's shape into the Cold War map, to fight rival visions of its destiny, to make sure that when the powerful drew new lines on the globe, someone at the table would slam his fist down and say, "No, not like that." The clocks were still ticking. Only now they were not just in London, they were everywhere. In New York, the clocks didn't even pretend to sleep. At 3 a.m, the city still burned with light, neon, headlights, the cold white squares of office windows where someone, somewhere was still typing another memo that might change the fate of a country. Below, taxis screamed past. Above, on the East River, the black water moved as if it were carrying secrets. In the middle of that, a single building glowed like a glass altar, the headquarters of the United Nations. Inside, under the curved ceiling of the General Assembly, the microphones stood ready, wires coiled like waiting snakes. Translation booths overlooked the hall like watchtowers. On the green marble of the great podium, a small metal clock sat quietly, its hands poised to punish anyone who forgot that speaking time was limited. No one hated that clock more than V.K. Krishna Menon. When he walked to the podium for the first time as India's chief delegate, there was a soft rustle in the hall. Some delegates stared with open curiosity. Others smirked. A few veterans of his London days stiffened automatically, like men bracing for a storm they remembered all too well. He did not look like a man you built careful consensus with. He looked like someone who had not slept enough in 30 years. Thin, stooped slightly, dark circles under sharp eyes that took in the whole room at once. His collar never quite sat right. His papers were never perfectly stacked. But when he began to speak, the disorder fell away. The subject was Kashmir. On the opposite side of the hall, the Pakistani delegate adjusted his headphones. Menon had seen him before, smooth, precise, brilliant at international law, presenting Pakistan's case for a plebiscite as if it were the only logical, civilized path. To much of the West, he sounded reasonable, even generous. To Menon, he was the newest face of an old enemy, the cautious rival, polished, persuasive, arguing that India must accept limits set by others. The chair gave Menon 45 minutes. He took 8 hours. He did not shout. He laid out in exhausting detail the history of Kashmir, princely states, accession documents, tribal raids, UN resolutions twisted and misquoted. He read from maps and treaties and letters no one else had bothered to find. Delegates shifted in their seats. Translators wiped sweat from their brows. Some walked out, then drifted back, drawn by a morbid curiosity. Could one man really talk an entire topic into submission? Outside, reporters counted the minutes, then the hours. Marathon speech, the headlines would say the next day. In the Pakistani press, he was Menon, a man who talked too much and achieved nothing. In India, he was either a hero or an embarrassment, depending on which newspaper you read. But for Menon, the point wasn't just the immediate vote. He was doing something more dangerous, teaching the world that India would not be spoken to like a junior partner, that every footnote in every imperial document could and would be used to claw back dignity, that the days when British lawyers could draw borders in a London office and expect silent compliance were over. In the quiet afterward, as cleaners moved through the hall, he sat alone in a side room, tie loosened, hands trembling slightly from fatigue. A junior Indian diplomat, eyes wide with admiration, whispered, "Sir, you broke the record. No one has ever spoken that long here." Menon gave him a flat look. "And did we win the vote?" "Not yet. They postponed." "Then we broke nothing that matters," he muttered. But there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Postponed meant delayed. Delayed meant time. Time for Indian soldiers to consolidate, for diplomats to lobby, for reality on the ground to harden into something the UN would eventually be forced to accept. The clock had tried to discipline him. He had turned it into his weapon instead. Kashmir was only one battlefield. There were others, hotter, deadlier, and governed by even harsher deadlines. In Korea, war had frozen into a nightmare stalemate. On one side, American-led UN forces. On the other, Chinese and North Korean troops, backed by Moscow. Between the trenches, corpses stiffened in the snow while politicians argued about prisoners of war. The Americans wanted rapid repatriation. The communists wanted guarantees. The war could flare back into open slaughter at any moment. In this desperate gap, India was asked to mediate, which meant in practice that Krishna Menon was asked to walk a tightrope stretched over a live battlefield. He flew between capitals, crunching across winter airfields in his light overcoat, stepping into rooms thick with cigarette smoke and suspicion. In Washington, generals glowered at him, convinced he was soft on communism. In Moscow, men with unreadable faces tested him with polite smiles. In Beijing's chilly delegations, Chinese envoys watched his every word for signs of betrayal. Each side thought they had more time. Menon knew they didn't. "Gentlemen," he said bluntly in one meeting, "every week you delay, more young men die for your reputations. How many corpses are you prepared to stack up to avoid a compromise?" The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Out of this grinding, tedious, risky shuttle diplomacy emerged the Indian proposal on prisoner repatriation, neutral supervision, voluntary return, a way to end the war without anyone explicitly admitting defeat. It was not perfect. It did not satisfy the hawks on either side. But it was just bearable enough to work. In July 1953, the guns in Korea fell largely silent. No one country could claim the armistice as its victory. The superpowers naturally congratulated themselves first. But in UN corridors, men who had once sneered at the noisy Indian now spoke grudgingly of the Menon proposal. Some even admitted in private that without his stubborn insistence on a middle path, the war might have burned far longer. Back in Delhi, Nehru read the cables and saw with a mix of pride and relief what his gamble had bought him. His difficult, abrasive friend from London was no longer just an internal asset. He was a figure the world could not ignore. That made him more dangerous than ever. Suez, 1956. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, that narrow blue line Europeans had treated as their private plumbing for a century. Britain and France, unable to believe a brown man could seize their waterway, plotted with Israel and sent in tanks and bombers. Old empires do not go quietly. They go raging. At the UN, the British and French delegates still carried the muscle memory of ruling half the world. They expected wobbles, protests, maybe a scolding. What they did not expect was to be denounced in front of the entire planet by a man who sounded as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. Menon stood at the podium, the green marble gleaming under the lights. He did not bother with diplomatic flattery. He spoke of colonialism as a crime, not a phase. He reminded the hall of decades of Western control over Middle Eastern oil and Asian labor. He compared the invasion of Egypt to the very fascist aggressions Europe claimed to have defeated only a decade earlier. The age in which European troops could occupy an Asian or African country and call it defensive order is over, he said, each syllable landing like a hammer. If you persist in this action, history will treat you no differently from the aggressors you hang in judgment at Nuremberg. In London, the press exploded. Menon, screamed one tabloid, is the most dangerous man at the UN. Another snarled that he was a hate-filled little man, bent on humiliating Britain at every turn. Yet, even as they spat venom, the facts on the ground changed. Under US and UN pressure and with global opinion turning sharply against them, Britain and France pulled out of Suez. For Menon, it was more than a diplomatic win. It was an exorcism. The same empire that had once ordered his father to stand aside on dusty roads now found itself lectured from a global pulpit by that man's son. The boy from Calicut was shoving Europe off a canal with nothing but words. But for every international cheer, there was a mutter growing louder back home. He is making enemies we cannot afford, warned one senior Indian politician. We are still poor, still dependent on Western aid. Does he think prestige can be eaten? Beneath those complaints lurked something uglier, jealousy. In Bombay's political circles, in the back rooms of the Congress Party, a different kind of cautious Indian weighed his options. He had none of Menon's international notoriety, but he had one vital advantage. He played by the old rules. He respected hierarchy. He did not insult powerful men in public. And he watched with cold calculation as Nehru's friendship with Menon deepened into trust. Sooner or later, he murmured to a confidant, either Menon will fall, or the rest of us will be pushed aside. He made it his quiet mission to ensure it was the former. In 1957, Menon stepped out of the shadows of minister without portfolio and into the brutal light of hard power. Nehru appointed him Minister of Defense. It was a staggering rise. Just 20 years earlier, he had been fighting to keep the heating on in a London bedsit. Now he controlled the armed forces of one of the world's largest countries. The reaction was instantaneous. In the Lok Sabha, opposition benches erupted in protests. In editorials, columnists fumed about Nehru's Rasputin. Senior generals, accustomed to dealing with mild-mannered bureaucrats, found themselves facing a civilian minister who tore into briefing papers like a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. Why are we buying rifles from Britain at this price? He demanded in one meeting, stabbing at a figure. Why can't we make them ourselves? Sir, with respect, an officer replied stiffly. We do not yet have the industrial base. Then build it, Menon snapped. Or do you propose we remain military dependents of the same countries that once ruled us? He drove the ministry like an overworked engine. Committees met late into the night. Files moved faster, then stalled, then moved again as he intervened personally. He cut deals for Soviet aircraft and equipment at prices that stunned Western observers. In hangar bays baked by the Indian sun, engineers in rolled-up sleeves crawled over the first MiG-21s. Soviet metal now welded into India's future. The time limit in his mind had changed shape. He was no longer counting down to independence. That battle was won, roughly, violently, with borders that still bled. Now he was counting down to something else. The moment when India would be forced to take sides in the Cold War or risk being crushed between others' ambitions. He believed he had perhaps 10 years to build enough military and diplomatic muscle for India to say no without being destroyed for it. So when another colonial relic refused to die, Goa, still a Portuguese possession long after 1947, he saw both a moral obligation and a strategic test. For 14 years, India had petitioned and pleaded. Lisbon, under Antonio Salazar's stubborn dictatorship, responded with contempt. Goa, they insisted, was not a colony but an integral part of metropolitan Portugal. Negotiations went nowhere. Behind the scenes, students were beaten, protesters jailed, small resistance movements smothered. In December 1961, patience ran out. Operation Vijay was planned with clinical speed. Indian troops, tanks, and aircraft massed quietly on the border. Paratroopers prepared to drop. The Navy positioned itself to cut off escape and reinforcement. There was one more battlefield to manage, the UN. As news of Indian troop movements leaked, Portugal rushed to the Security Council, demanding condemnation, sanctions, a ceasefire. Western allies, still smarting from Suez and completely unwilling to see another European flag lowered by brown hands, were eager to intervene. Timing became a weapon. Hold them in debate. Nehru's message to Menon effectively said, "We need 48 hours. No resolutions before then." It was the old London trick, now played on a global stage. In New York, Menon took the floor and began to speak about the history of Goa, about centuries of forced conversions and slave trade, about the absurdity of a European power clinging to a tiny pocket of territory on India's western coast in 1961. He talked while Indian tanks rolled through dusty Goan roads. He argued while Portuguese officers debated whether to fight a hopeless battle. He needled the council with an almost cruel irony. If India's action in Goa is aggression, then what shall we call 400 years of European conquest in Asia? Cultural exchange? By the time a draft resolution urging a ceasefire was finally ready, it was obsolete. Portuguese forces had surrendered. The Indian flag flew over Panaji. The hall buzzed with anger. Some called it a trick. Others a masterclass in synchronized diplomacy and military action. Menon, drained, knew only this. Another piece of the old world had fallen, and India had done it on its own terms. But every victory deepened the shadows around him. In army mess halls, whispers circulated. Menon humiliated senior officers, meddled in promotions, trusted too few professionals. The resignation of the respected army chief, General K. Isthmaya, in 1959, offered in protest at Menon's interference, and later withdrawn after Nehru's persuasion, became a scandal that refused to die. In drawing rooms in Delhi, the cautious Indian reappeared in a sharper form. The career politician from Bombay, the seasoned parliamentarian, the patient enemy. Let him talk in the UN all he likes, he told a circle of allies. When the day comes that the army fails, the country will not remember the details. It will remember one name. He knew that in a nation still haunted by memories of partition, nothing destroyed a leader faster than the perception that he had left the borders undefended. On the maps in South Bloc, another border curved like a question mark across the Himalayas. For years, Nehru and Menon had staked much on friendship with the People's Republic of China, Panchsheel, Asian solidarity, the dream of two great civilizational states standing together outside Western alliances. Zhou Enlai and Nehru had smiled for photographers, signed agreements, spoken of Hindi Chini bye-bye, Indians and Chinese as brothers. Menon, who had distrusted empires of every color, allowed himself briefly to believe that this new power would be different. Reality crept in on freezing mountain winds. Chinese troops advanced quietly onto disputed ridges. Patrols clashed in icy passes that existed more on colonial survey maps than in the consciousness of villagers below. In 1959, when the Tibetan uprising erupted and the Dalai Lama fled into India, relations chilled visibly. Beijing's propaganda denounced Indian expansionism. Indian newspapers screamed about Chinese treachery. Inside the defense ministry, maps were argued over like indictments. "We are not ready for war in the high Himalayas," one senior officer said flatly. "We lack roads, artillery, winter clothing." "If we show weakness," Menon countered, "they will come further. A line must be held." He pushed forward the forward policy, small Indian posts inching up to assert presence along the contested frontier. It was, in theory, a way to avoid conceding territory without mobilizing for full-scale war. In practice, it scattered lightly armed units across killer terrain, within reach of a battle-hardened People's Liberation Army. Critics in the cabinet, in uniform, and in the press lined up their charges like bullets. He starved the army of modern equipment to fund his political schemes. He ignored intelligence reports warning of Chinese buildup. He treated generals as clerks. Some of it was exaggeration, some fiercely debated by historians even today, but politics rarely waits for footnotes. In the high passes of Nepha and Ladakh, snow thickened. Winter was coming. In Beijing and Delhi, planners looked at the same mountains and saw the same constraint. If an attack was to be launched, it must be before the snows made movement impossible. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. On an October morning in 1962, Chinese guns opened up. Shells tore into Indian positions perched on ridges like fragile nests. Soldiers in thin greatcoats clutching outdated rifles were flung into a battle they had not been prepared, equipped, or psychologically trained for. Posts were overrun in hours. In some sectors, entire units were wiped out. Retreats turned into routes on narrow mountain paths. In Delhi, radio reports hit the defense ministry like blows. Menon sat through briefings that grew worse by the hour. Red lines on maps sagged backward. Place names unknown to most Indians, Sela, Bomdila, Rezangla, became overnight synonyms for disaster and desperate bravery. In Parliament, the cautious Indian, no longer cautious, rose with righteous fury. This, he thundered, is what comes of arrogance. This is what comes of neglecting our defenses while playing world statesman. The country has been misled. Our Jawans have been betrayed. The opposition benches slammed their desks in agreement. Even some Congress MPs, cheeks burning with humiliation, joined in. The newspapers, which had once alternated between mocking and grudgingly admiring Menon, now descended on him like vultures. He spent years lecturing the world, one editorial spat, and forgot to protect his own frontiers. Cartoonists drew him asleep at a desk while Chinese soldiers marched past his window. Nehru, exhausted, hair whiter than ever, stood in the middle of a storm that threatened to sweep away not just his defense minister, but his entire legacy. Messages from the front were clear. Morale was cracking. Panic spread in border regions. Refugees poured into Assam. There were hushed, terrified questions in villages far from the mountains. Are the Chinese coming here next? Diplomatic cables from friendly capitals arrived with offers of emergency aid, weapons, even Western military missions. The same powers Menon had spent a decade chastising now held out hurried lifelines. In quiet, bitter conversations, senior Congress leaders told Nehru the truth he had tried to avoid. Panditji, the country is united in its grief. But if Menon remains in office, that unity will fracture. Someone must take responsibility. He has become the symbol of this failure. If he stays, you will fall with him. It was the most brutal kind of time limit. Political survival measured in hours of public outrage. On a November night in 1962, the lights in South Block burned late. In a sparsely furnished room, two old friends faced each other across a desk cluttered with maps, cables, and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. Outside, the muffled rumble of generators, distant honks, the hum of a city that lay awake with fear. Menon looked thinner than ever, his shoulders bowed not just by years but by the weight of accusation. Nehru looked older, the lines on his face carved deeper in just a few weeks. They want my head, Menon said quietly, without self-pity. They want reassurance, Nehru replied. They want someone to blame, and they are not entirely wrong to ask questions. There was a long silence. You know I did what I thought was best, Menon said. I have given everything to this country. I know, Nehru answered. But knowing is not enough. The country cannot see what we see in this room. It sees the dead, it sees the retreat, it sees you, he did not say, and it sees me for appointing you, trusting you, defending you until the last possible moment. Menon exhaled, a sound like something tearing inside his chest. Then I will go, he said simply. If my going buys you time to repair this, then that will be my last service. The resignation, when announced, landed like a thunderclap. Some celebrated, some felt a sting of pity. A few who understood how much of India's international standing and early military development had been shaped by this difficult man watched in uneasy silence. In the defense ministry, clerks quietly took his nameplate off the door. In army messes, toasts were raised to a future, hopefully without political interference. In Bombay and Delhi, the cautious rival smiled thinly. The storm had done his work for him. Late that night, a car pulled away from South Block. Inside, Krishna Menon sat alone, files in his lap, watching the city slide past. The dim shapes of statues, the solemn columns of government buildings, the sleeping bungalows of ministers who had avoided his calls in recent days. His heart, already scarred by years of strain, thudded heavily. He had fought the British Empire, wrestled with superpowers, carved India's voice into the conscience of the world. Now brought down not by a colonial viceroy but by his own country's disaster, he stared out at the dark and realized something that hurt more than exile, more than insult. History, which he had chased so relentlessly, does not pause for explanations. It moves on. But he was not finished yet. Not with his enemies. Not with his country. And certainly not with time itself, which had once seemed like an ally and now circled back as his most implacable rival. The car slid through the Delhi night like a black bullet that had forgotten its target. Behind the rolled-up windows, the city was a blur of dim street lamps and dusty trees, security checkpoints and the occasional flicker of a pawn stall still open for one last customer. The great sandstone ministries of the new republic loomed and then vanished, their colonnades briefly lighting the glass before drowning back into shadow. Inside VK, Krishna Menon sat with a stack of files on his lap and nothing left to sign. For the first time in decades, he held no office, no ministry, no portfolio, no army saluting, no bureaucrats waiting with notepads, no late-night cables demanding a reply before dawn. Only a city that had decided he was to blame. He watched South Block recede through the rear window, its solemn dome shrinking into the distance. In his mind, it was not the building that moved away, it was himself, rolling back from the center of power, carriage by carriage, like a train shunted off to a sidetrack while the main express thundered past. He had fought the British Empire with pamphlets in damp London basements, faced down superpowers under the harsh lights of the UN, pushed tanks into Goa while talking the Security Council in circles. Brought low not by a foreign enemy but by his own country's fear and fury, Menon felt something inside him snarl in protest. They think this is the end. It was not. Morning proved just how far he had fallen. The same newspapers that once tracked his marathon speeches now printed his photograph like a mugshot. "Menon quits," blared the headlines. Some added, "at last." Others dispensed with restraint altogether. "Architect of disaster resigns." In smoky editorial rooms, sub-editors competed to coin the cruelest line. In one Delhi drawing room, the cautious politician from Bombay, the man whose polished patience had shadowed Menon's career for years, folded a newspaper and smiled without showing his teeth. "Now let us see," he murmured to his circle of loyalists, "whether his tongue alone can save him." Parliament sat under a low, tense cloud. Questions rained down about the war. Why were the troops ill-equipped? Who had ignored intelligence reports? Who had humiliated the brass? Each query, no matter how formally worded, carried a hidden payload. Menon, Menon, Menon. He had resigned. He no longer sat on the front bench, but his ghost hovered over every sentence. When he did speak in the weeks that followed, it was from a back seat, not the Treasury bench. His voice was the same, dry, sharp, unforgiving, but it now came from the shadows. "I will not accept," he told the House one afternoon, "that every failure of a system built over 15 years is to be pinned on one man merely because he is convenient to attack. If you want a scapegoat, put a goat in this chair, not a human being." Laughter rippled, then died quickly. The cautious rival rose slowly as if sorrowed by the need to reply. "No one," he said in his grave, measured tone, "questions my honorable friend's dedication, but the fact remains, under his stewardship, our defenses failed. This is not personal. It is a matter of responsibility. The people of India live under a shadow because the warnings of professionals were ignored and the arrogance of one man prevailed. It was a duel, but the weapons were no longer equal. Menon's strength had always been in turning the gaze outward, from India to empire, from the weak to the strong. Now the target was himself. Every sentence in his defense sounded, to ears stunned by defeat, like evasion. Every cut he aimed at his rival's caution bounced off the armor of a man who had not been in charge when the mountains burned. Outside the chamber, another clock had started ticking. Age, which Menon had ignored as ruthlessly as he ignored dress codes and diplomatic small talk, could no longer be bullied. He was in his late 60s, his heart already bearing the scars of years spent fueled by tea, insomnia, and adrenaline. Doctors murmured about blood pressure, stress, the need for rest. Rest? He had been at war with someone or something since he was a teenager in Calicut. The very idea of slowing down felt like betrayal, of Nehru, of India, of the hundreds of anonymous comrades who had given their quiet lives to a struggle that barely remembered their names, but he could count. He knew he did not have another 20 years to rebuild his reputation, perhaps not even 10. If he did not claw back his place in public life quickly, his story would be sealed with one brutal line in school textbooks. Defense. Minister during the 1962 debacle, he had spent a lifetime refusing to let Britain write India's history. Now he faced a smaller but more vicious threat. India might miswrite his own. Then in May 1964, the world he knew ended with a cough. Jawaharlal Nehru died in his sleep in Teen Murti House. For a moment, Delhi seemed to stop breathing. People poured into the streets, barefoot clerks and white-capped Congress workers, cycle rickshaw pullers and saris streaked with tears. They moved as if drawn by gravity towards the funeral pyre. Menon was there, a dark, wiry figure at the edge of the inner circle, eyes fixed on the flames. The rivalry with the British was gone. The world of Bandung and Suez and Pan-Asian dreams faded in the crackle of burning sandalwood. The one man who had believed without condition that India needed Krishna Menon, even when the entire cabinet was begging him to let go, lay wrapped in cloth and smoke. A photographer's camera caught a single fierce tear on Menon's cheek. Without Nehru, his enemies did not have to be polite. The cautious politician from Bombay moved faster than anyone else. In the committee rooms where the next prime minister was decided, he made his case with quiet confidence. Seniority, administrative. Experience, a reputation for honesty. And he added in conversations too discreet to be recorded, "I warned him about Menon. I will not repeat his mistake." He did not become prime minister then. That honor went first to Lal Bahadur Shastri, the gentle leader from Uttar Pradesh. But the Bombay man's message landed. In cabinet lists drafted in tidy handwriting, one name was conspicuously absent. V.K. Krishna Menon was not invited back. For the first time since independence, the machinery of government whirred on without him. His official bungalow was taken away. He moved into smaller quarters, then into the home of friends. The giant files vanished. In their place, stacks of old speeches and books swallowed his rooms. He walked now not through echoing ministry corridors, but along cracked Delhi pavements, a familiar but slightly out-of-date figure, in a city already growing used to forgetting him. Yet even in semi-exile, he refused to shut up. If Parliament would not give him a microphone, universities would. Trade unions would. Student unions in Kerala and West Bengal, radical lawyers in Bombay, young men in ill-fitting shirts who had never heard of Suez but knew Vietnam and Che Guevara, these became his new audience. He spoke not for hours now, but sometimes for just 20 concentrated minutes, in classrooms that smelled of chalk and sweat. Our danger, he told one such gathering in Bombay, is not only from foreign powers but from the little Britishers in our own midst, men who speak our languages but think in imperial terms. They wear khadi, but their minds are dressed in someone else's suit. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a polished office, the cautious rival frowned as reports of these speeches reached him. "He still poisons the wells," he muttered. "We must keep him out. As long as he has breath, he will try to come back." In 1967, the battleground shifted to the place that had first made Menon a household name, the electoral map. The country was restless. Food shortages, corruption scandals, the lingering humiliation of 1962, unease with the growing influence of foreign corporations. These had frayed the Congress Party's once unbreakable hold on power. For the first time since independence, it looked genuinely vulnerable. Menon made his move. He asked for the Congress ticket from his old constituency in northeast Bombay, the seat that had sent him to Parliament at the height of his fame. Local workers remembered him. The city's large number of South Indians and leftists admired his stubborn independence. But now the decision lay not in Bombay's chawls and factories, but in airy rooms in Delhi, where a working committee dominated by the cautious rival weighed his request. "He is a liability," the rival said calmly. "The war, the generals, the scandals, the middle class has not forgiven him. If we nominate him, every opposition party will use his name as a cudgel." Others shifted uneasily. Some still respected Menon or feared the backlash in Bombay if he was humiliated. The rival knew how to close the trap. "Let him contest if he wishes," he added with a faint shrug. "But not with the Congress symbol. If he truly has support, he will win regardless." The ticket went to another man. When the news reached Menon, he did not waste time on outrage. Time was the one thing he no longer had in surplus. Within days, he announced that he would contest as an independent. The campaign that followed had the feel of both a comeback tour and a last stand. He had no party machine behind him, just clusters of volunteers, students painting banners by hand, union workers shaking collection, boxes at factory gates, old socialists dredging up memories of anti-British marches. Opposing him were the full resources of the Congress organization, jeeps, posters, professionally printed slogans, the inherited aura of the party that had won freedom. From early morning till late midnight, Menon moved through humid Bombay lanes, his thin frame wrapped in a simple kurta, sweat darkening the cloth. He coughed blood into handkerchiefs when no one was looking. Doctors whispered about his heart, but he ignored them. "If I stop now," he told a worried friend. They win the final argument. That time has defeated me. I would rather die talking. On counting day, as steel ballot boxes were prized open in a school hall that smelled of ink and dust, the race seesawed wildly. In some rounds he led to bursts of ecstatic cheering. In others he trailed, his supporters huddled around transistor radios turning pale. By evening, the returning officer cleared his throat and read the final figures. Menon had lost, by a few thousand votes, close enough to sting like a burn, far enough to be undeniable. Reporters rushed to capture his reaction. He could have blamed the Congress machine, the betrayal by his old colleagues, the lingering anger of 1962. Instead, he simply said, "The people have spoken. They are never wrong, but they are sometimes late." The phrase landed strangely, half bitter, half prophetic. On the other side of the city, the cautious rival exhaled in relief. Another door had been closed. Another clock, he believed, had run out. But history loves twists, especially for men who refuse to accept the role written for them. 2 years later, in a humid district in West Bengal, a by-election was announced for a vacant Lok Sabha seat. Midnapore, the Communist Party of India and local left groups, mindful of Menon's uncompromising anti-imperialism and his newfound independence, from Congress made an audacious offer. "Come here," they said. "Stand from Midnapore. We will back you." For a man born on the Malabar coast, educated in Madras and London, who had represented Bombay and spoken for India in New York, the cyclone-prone fields of Bengal seemed an unlikely last refuge. But politics had shifted. The Congress grip was loosening in state after state. New alliances were being forged on the left. More importantly, time was still ticking. He accepted. The campaign in Midnapore was rougher, more elemental than Bombay. There were no cocktail parties, no polite press conferences. Instead, bullock carts with loudspeakers blaring his speeches into villages, meetings held by kerosene lamp, farmers wiping their hands on lunges before coming to shake his. Many of them had never heard his old UN interventions. They did not know Suez from Kashmir. But they recognized something in his voice: anger on behalf of the small man, refusal to bow to the rich and powerful, contempt for hypocrisy. On polling day, barefoot villagers filed into creaking schoolrooms and thatched booths. This time, when the votes were tallied, the result was a landslide. VK. Krishna Menon was a member of parliament again. He walked back into the Lok Sabha a little more stooped, hair thinner, suit hanging a bit loose, but with a seat guaranteed by people who had backed him not as Nehru's favorite or Congress's star, but as a man they believed would speak straight. If the House had changed, he hid his disappointment poorly. The old titans were gone or fading. New leaders came in speaking a different language: development plans, bank nationalization, Garibi Hatao. The young MPs around him had grown up with radio, not ration cards. Their battles were for subsidies and subsidies photographs, not against an empire's flag. When Menon rose to speak, the benches did not always fill. Some conversations continued in the lobby. Yet when fragments of his speeches did reach the microphones, they still cut. He attacked American bombing in Vietnam with the same ferocity he had once reserved for British colonialism. He skewered the World Bank and the IMF as new landlords in well-pressed suits. He warned that merely changing the color of the ruler's skin was not enough. If power in Delhi moved from one elite circle to another, the villages would see little difference. He did not spare his old rival either. As finance minister and senior leader, the cautious politician had become the face of the party's conservative wing, defending austerity while preaching morality. Some men, Menon said acidly in one debate, believe virtue consists of balancing a ledger while the poor starve outside the counting house. They were comfortable under the British because they understood pounds and shillings. They are comfortable today because they understand rupees and pays. What they do not understand is justice. The target felt the arrow and hid the wound behind icy politeness. Yet the real battle now lay beyond parliamentary point scoring. In 1969, the Congress Party split wide open. On one side stood the old guard, the syndicate, led in spirit by the cautious rival, determined to preserve the party's traditional hierarchies and policies. On the other was the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, younger, bolder, and increasingly radical in rhetoric. Menon, ever suspicious of institutions calcifying into self-protection, looked at the two camps and chose the one that promised movement, however risky. He sided broadly with Indira. They were not close. He mistrusted her flirtations with personality cult. She remembered well the chaos of 1962, but they shared a belief that India needed to stand apart from Western military blocs and push more aggressively for social justice. From the backbenches, Menon watched with a strange blend of satisfaction and dread as his rival overplayed his hand. The cautious man, confident that he could discipline the prime minister as he had so many others, moved to expel her loyalists and strip her of party support. Instead, she walked out of the syndicate's shadow, called his bluff, and took most of the party and the voters with her. Within a few years, the rival who had shadowboxed Menon for decades would find himself outside government, reduced to lecturing from the opposition benches, plotting a last great comeback of his own. But by then, Menon's time would be almost over. In 1971, as war clouds gathered again, this time over East Pakistan, he watched India move towards a conflict he considered both morally necessary and dangerously entangling. He had no official role. Younger diplomats and ministers now took the flights to New York, held the folders, faced the cameras. Sitting in a modest room in Delhi, he followed the Security Council debates on a flickering black-and-white television. He recognized the choreography, speeches about aggression and self-defense, drafts of resolutions, frantic corridor consultations. He heard echoes of his own phrases in the mouths of men who had once rolled their eyes at him. India would win this war. Bangladesh would be born. Refugees would go home. On paper, it looked like the kind of victory that had eluded him in 1962, but the price he feared was a deeper dependence on one of the superpowers. The Indo-Soviet Treaty, the arms deals, the new alignment. It all felt uncomfortably like stepping closer to a bear while fleeing an eagle. In a small meeting with students after the war, he spoke more freely than any minister could have afforded to. If we are not careful, he warned, we will exchange one set of pressures for another. Today we take Soviet guns because the Americans arm our enemies. Tomorrow someone in Moscow may decide we owe them obedience in return. Independence is not a medal you pin once. It is a daily struggle. By then his body was beginning to fail in ways that rhetoric could not bully into obedience. Angina gripped his chest as he climbed stairs to podiums. His hands shook when he held notes. Friends begged him to rest, to write his memoirs, to dictate his side of the story of 1962 before others buried it under their own. He shook his head. Memoirs, he said with thin scorn, are for men who want to make peace with how they lived. I have never been at peace, and I will not start lying to myself now. Still, late at night, he sat alone amid piles of papers, under the harsh glow of a single bulb, going over old documents, the draft of the Korean armistice proposal, his notes from Suez, telegrams from Nehru scrawled with affectionate exasperation. He knew that once he was gone, these would be reduced, if he was lucky, to a few lines in someone else's footnotes. The last race was no longer for office or influence. It was against erasure. In the monsoon of 1974, Delhi's air turned heavy and unforgiving. Menon, now 78, moved slower. The city had grown around him. More cars, more concrete, more students who pronounced his name without quite knowing why it mattered. On an overcast October day, he was at a friend's house in the capital when the pain came sharp and deep. Those present remembered later the flash of irritation in his eyes, as if he were annoyed at his own body for choosing this moment. "Don't fuss," he rasped, as hands tried to help him to a chair. "I have argued with bigger bullies than this." They took him to hospital. The machines beeped. White coats leaned over the thin, stubborn frame that had once faced empires and armies. For once, time would not be talked down. On 6 October 1974, VK, Krishna Menon's heart finally gave out. The official obituaries were correct, polite, and incomplete. They called him controversial, brilliant, abrasive. They mentioned his role in the non-aligned movement, his record-breaking UN speech, his responsibility for the China debacle. They did not mention the cold nights in London when he went hungry to pay for printing pamphlets, or the look on a young Korean soldier's face when the shooting stopped because a proposal with his name on it had been accepted. In Delhi, he received a state funeral of sorts, flags at half-mast, a wreath or two from leaders who had once flinched at his phone calls. In Kerala, the grief was more raw. In Calicut and Trivandrum, thousands lined the streets, chanting his name, not as a cautionary tale, but as one of their own who had aimed his anger at distant thrones. The cautious rival, now an elder statesman in opposition, sent his formal condolences. Perhaps in a private moment he allowed himself a sigh of relief. The man whose existence had always complicated his own narrative of prudence and restraint was finally gone. Yet the rivalry did not end with their lives. Years later, when that rival would briefly become prime minister, he would try to roll back parts of the world Menon had helped build, questioning non-alignment, tilting towards the West, sneering at socialist experiments. The two visions of India, combustible, defiant, noisy versus disciplined, gradual, respectable, would continue to fight in manifestos, election rallies, street protests, and somewhere in New York, under the curved ceiling of the General Assembly, the little metal clock still sat on the green marble podium. Delegates from countries that did not exist when Menon first arrived, Bangladesh, Namibia, dozens of liberated African and Asian states, took the microphone. Some spoke in the cool, measured tones of career diplomats. Others let anger color their words as they denounced new forms of exploitation, debt traps, proxy wars, multinationals strip mining their futures. A few of them had read in some dim university library about an Indian who once spoke for 8 hours until the translators nearly fainted. They did not imitate his length. The UN had changed, so had the rules. But in the sharp edges of their phrases, in their refusal to accept the language of great powers as natural law, there was an echo of the man the British press had once called the most dangerous in the world. In textbooks, he remained for a long time a footnote soaked in controversy. In the memories of those who had watched him, jaw clenched, tie crooked, eyes blazing, as he turned words into weapons, he was something else, a reminder that history is not made only by the reasonable and the polite. Sometimes it is shoved forward by someone who will not yield to the clock, who will talk and fight and push until even his enemies are forced to admit that the world, when he is done with it, is not quite the same as when he began. VK. Krishna Menon raced time and lost, as all men do. But if you look closely at the decolonized maps, at the independent voices in global halls where once only empires spoke, at the instincts of a country that still flinches at being told what to do by stronger powers, you can see the faint, stubborn print of his footsteps. They lead not to a neat, heroic ending, but to something messier, more human, and far harder to erase.